Welcome to Subject to Power. I'm Elle. This episode is a part of a collection of episodes where we talk about prostitution and the broader sexual exploitation industries. So here's a heads up that this conversation will have quite a bit of sexually explicit detail. So listen responsibly. If you have thought about prostitution or the sex trade as a niche issue, not something that directly affects your corner of reality or the culture in which you live, I really welcome you to this conversation I had with Elly Arrow. Elly researches, writes, and speaks about all aspects of prostitution in her homeland of Germany, and also around the world. And Germany is particular in that 20-some years ago, it gave a state-sanctioned approval to the sex trade and decided to make prostitution legal and a legitimate industry in the cities and towns of Germany. And in this hour, Elly and I talk about what it was like to come of age as a young woman in a pro-prostitution culture, how it has affected relationships between men and women in her country, and how the normalization of prostitution has bled into so many other sectors: housing, employment, labor, children's rights, local and federal politics, race relations, immigration, policing, etc., etc. We also talk about the debate that is now being had in Germany about whether to adopt the equality model, which would criminalize men who buy sex as well as third parties who profit from it, but not women who sell themselves. Whether to try to rein in the prostitution industry and everything it has wrought on German society, or whether to continue to support the state-sanctioned selling of women for men's sexual use and abuse under the ever-popular sex work label. I got to know you and your writings and videos partly through Red Light Expose, but also I followed you on Twitter and on other social media. How did you get into this arena? How did you get so interested in prostitution?
So it's a mix of, I'd say, growing up female and then having the right people and right literature around to start making sense of things when they started to feel out of control. During my teenagehood, more and more stories trickled in from other girls about harassment, assault, rape. I mean, I grew up in a university town, quite, middle class, and people have this erroneous belief it doesn't happen. It only happens to some classes of people and not others. Like in all the tourist brochures, it looks too cozy for these kinds of things to happen, but they were happening to girls all around me, by strangers, by family members, and obviously boys and young men in the context of dating. And there were strange commonalities between the stories, so about specific sex acts that, as a less experienced teenage girl, I'd never thought about. And very often when a crime's committed, there's a camera there. And I started wondering, why? What's going on? Why are these assaults so similar? Why do so many perpetrators feel comfortable filming their crimes? And a friend introduced me to the work of Gail Dines, who is a renowned feminist porn researcher. So suddenly it started making sense because I wasn't a porn consumer as a teen. I didn't get that the kinds of acts were staples of pornography, which I think most people know has gotten worse with the onset of the internet, has gotten more brutal over time, and it's seeping into the bedrooms of most people, I'd say, certainly of the younger generation. And I found that unsettling and unacceptable. And then, so I had this side of the story where it's happening to women and girls outside the industry. But then I looked into who are the women and sometimes girls in the industry? What are their lives like? Why are they there? Who's really making the money? Who really is in control? And I realized it's a highly criminal industry. A lot of porn would be more accurately described as paid rape. Even very famous porn performers have gone public saying, yeah, you all know my name now, but when you watch those scenes, I didn't want to be there. I was dissociating. I was injured. And then I made the connection from there. Oh, actually, porn and prostitution, those are not two separate industries. Many porn performers have to engage in prostitution to make ends meet. Many women in prostitution have to do some level of porn to make ends meet. And these share tons of similarities. And I live in a country, Germany, that's globally, at this stage, I'd say infamous for our legal red light districts. Essentially, I just arrived at a point where I felt I'd spent a lot of time staring into a dark abyss of abuse that's not talked about very much, and that I realize touches my life, touches the lives of so many women and girls I care about, young men too, and I need to do something about it. And that's essentially, I've been speaking up ever since, I've been researching ever since, and at this stage, I know plenty of individuals and organizations who debate this issue, who lobby around this issue. So built on that outrage, I have accumulated a lot of knowledge, both from individual conversations, from reading policy papers. Now I work part-time doing this kind of research. Once you really wake up to this issue, you either fight against it or you can't sleep at night, is kind of how it felt to me.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me. One of the things I really appreciate about your public speaking, your YouTube channel and blog and everything else that you do is that you constantly connect the prostitution industry in Germany with its larger culture. And I watched your history of prostitution video, which was so fascinating to me. You know, I'm from Northern Europe too, and we have a similar history. People call it the oldest profession. It's not a profession to my mind, but it is a very old practice. And so it's rooted in somewhere. You do such a fantastic job of explaining that.
Yeah, the history is long, so people are not wrong that it's a very old practice. But various historians, especially feminist historians, have traced the history and said, well, if we go back several thousands of years, yes, prostitution does arise. We have evidence, like in the Hammurabi Code, in these really ancient cultures of women being paid for access to their bodies. But we have to understand the wider context. These are militarized cultures, they're slave cultures, they're hierarchical, sedentary, unequal, quite violent. So prostitution doesn't arise because some women decide, oh, let's make a few bucks. There is nearly always third parties, there's infrastructure around it, it's organized. And the idea that men have a right to sex, men need sex, men, like this boiler cooker theory of men, if they don't have sex, they'll go rape the good women, the civilian women, that's very old. And basically any highly militarized culture that arises has that. So you have military-specific brothels, you have aristocrat-specific brothels, and then you have everyday men-specific brothels. And life is pretty brutal for women throughout. I find it kind of wild when TV and movies, they try to romanticize prostitution because before condoms, I mean, just the risk of infections and miscarriages and unwanted pregnancies and injuries that medicine couldn't yet treat. I mean, it is bad now, but imagine several thousands or hundreds of years ago. Even for like a high-class courtesan, prostitution was repeatedly an early death sentence for women. And it has always gone along with segregating women. So red light districts are in specific parts of town often. Women have to show to people that they are prostituted. They wear specific kinds of clothes or symbols so that people can differentiate them from the so-called civilian women. For instance, well, in Islamic cultures, the decent women are veiled while the enslaved women are not veiled. And again, slave and prostitute is often synonymous historically. I mean, we know that servant girls are a good example historically. Don't just have to scrub floors. If the master wants access to her body, that's there as well. And prostitution is just the same thing with a few different formalities. So when men start depriving women of resources, of housing, land, food, whatever, education, when that starts to arise, that's when prostitution rears its head. So it comes from inequality. It doesn't come because some women are just kinky and they love novelty. That's not why the industry is around. And that has changed very little. So from Mesopotamia to modern Germany, it's, again, been the idea that men have a right to do this. And some women are born for this. They can take it, they can handle it. And there's always been a degree of tolerance for the men who want to come and buy. They have the wife for producing children at home, and the wife for pleasure is the courtesan or the brothel or there's so many different names, concubine, but it's all roughly the same idea.
That they can treat however they want. Isn't that the idea that, the wife, they have a certain social standard that's owed to them, but the women they buy, they have freedom to abuse or do whatever they want with?
Yeah, society has always had a surprising, or maybe not surprising, a depressing amount of compassion for the man who has needs. But the woman, she's kind of gross and a deviant, and we only kind of tolerate her. And that's basically never changed. So when people say prostitution is legal or illegal, I always ask them, but what party are we talking about? How does society treat the buyer? How does society treat the bought? How does society treat the third party? And the men in the equation have always fared much better in a societal view and legal treatment, while the women end up shunned and criminalized. And this continues to this day, even in Germany now. Yes, it's legal, but can a woman put down on her CV, oh, I worked 8 years at a brothel? No, of course not. People don't think, oh, that's just a certain set of job skills. Not really. If people find out that someone's mother used to be in prostitution at school or is in prostitution, those kids get relentlessly bullied. The social acceptance isn't there. But if a man says, I'm so lonely or my wife won't put out.
Yeah, we have sympathy.
There's too much sympathy still. So that's a rough summary.
Yeah. And also, of course, it went straight through the world wars and all the atrocities that happened in Germany to the Jewish population and many other populations in Germany, the concentration camps and so on. The brothels, the prostitution went straight through that period.
Yeah, so the idea, I'm not just saying that, the idea that men have a right to sex or that we can easily motivate men to work harder or be better soldiers through access to women is so strong that there were concentration camp brothels all across the Nazi-controlled areas. And that is something that even historians haven't wanted to touch because, well, I mean, there's many reasons around this. There are various groups that the Nazis persecuted that we spent several decades forgetting about. So gay people and women in prostitution, because this is like, whenever you think that the Nazi regime can't get any worse, they were arresting women when they were in prostitution for their own personal profit and then put them in state-controlled military or concentration camp brothels. And what do you say about that? So when a society is pro-prostitution, that has basically never meant being pro-woman in prostitution. And which is why we as critics of prostitution are often accused of hating the woman in the industry by not viewing her as an autonomous worker. And I'd say it's the opposite. Yes, we despise the system, but it's because we think she's a three-dimensional human being, not a sex machine, which is how the industry inherently treats her. It essentially says there are some women born, and any stranger that rocks up to the door or that today, texts her on some kind of messaging app for the so-called escort part of the industry, whatever random guy shows up, whatever his age, his looks, his taste, his smell, she can take it. That is treating a person as a sex machine. No one's sexuality works like that. Nobody is totally physically and emotionally fine with random stranger after random stranger who goes there to dictate, okay, today I feel like oral, today I want anal, today I want to film her, today I want a gangbang, today I want a pregnant woman, today I want a barely adult person, today I want her to role play that she's a minor, today I want to cut her skin because I'm a BDSM fetishist sadist. Like, that there are some women who can just handle that and it's okay. And these women, now we have these terms of sex work and say, oh, now we call them sex workers. That makes everything better. But what the women are going through in their day-to-day hasn't changed. We've just slapped nice labels on it.
Yeah, so you have a whole country of Germany who's made this bargain, who's essentially saying to the citizens of its country, we're going to have a segregated class of vulnerable women who are there to service anybody who wants to use them in any manner whatsoever, violate them in any manner whatsoever. And that's going to be our culture. We're going to have that class of women. What does it do to the morale of women in general in Germany, you think?
So there's definitely ripple effects into society. I know these are not unique. Germany's just a very strong case study. So when a society says prostitution is work, sex work is work, it changes our view of what sex is and it changes our view of what work is. So there's so many questions. Can the job office offer prostitution as a potential option for unemployed women? Now, the reality is we've had court cases that mandate that a woman you cannot, under threat of having your benefits cut, be forced into a brothel. Thank God. If we actually believe sex work is work, there'd be no reason not to do that. But thankfully, we're not doing that. But even just having the brothel on the list of job options says to an unemployed woman, this is an acceptable way out of unemployment. This is okay. The government, the institutions think this is fine. Any unemployed woman, that impacts her. Escort agencies love advertising to university students because men who pay for prostitution love the idea. They're just some kinky 20-something, very young female students who just love engaging with cultured men and going to 5-star hotels. It's so wonderful. So they really, really target that population. And I've been that population. And I used to live in Munich, which is one of our wealthiest cities with the worst housing market. I'll get to that in a second as well. And I was just walking the street and there were stickers from an escort agency saying, do you need money? Do you want to have a part-time job? And then images of glamorous, probably like stock footage models. No men present, because if you had all like the middle-aged, beer-bellied men, if you had a real depiction of what it's like, if you had the pictures of the men you'll be engaging with, it wouldn't be so easy to glamorize. And then, of course, it's on TV, on radio. You have all these stories about, isn't this wonderful? So there's many, many attempts of recruiting women into the industry. There's cultural attempts. I know many women who at least considered and some who went through with this. And I mentioned the housing market. That's its whole thing, where this happened to me so many times. Basically, every time I go look for an apartment as a single woman, one-person household, I have prospective landlords say, I can offer me like rent that is eerily low, that is unusually low, or say you can live here for free. Sometimes they say things like, this is a nudist household. I'll just be walking around naked. Other times they're like, you can live here, but I'd like to meet you for a beer. So what they want is a live-in private rape slave. I know we say sex slave because the word rape makes us uncomfortable, but it is a rape slave. And I know women who've had to accept arrangements such as these. So I'm not saying it happens all the time. The harassment is very high frequency. These men, they predate on woman after woman, and maybe number 80 says yes. Or maybe number 80 doesn't speak the language well and doesn't realize, because they use coded language, what he wants from her. And finally, like, how are we ever getting rid of the idea? Like, we all know there's a plague. Women talk about this all the time. They date men, and then you go to a restaurant or a bistro, whatever. He pays for the drink, the meal, and she decides, I'm not really into this. I'm not going home with him. I'm not taking the next step physically. And the man goes, I paid for this. Like, how can you just get up and leave? I invested in you. Like, how are we ever getting rid of the idea that you can buy access to a woman in that dating setting? I think this has happened to almost every woman who dates men at some point, or some variation of this.
Of course.
Or gifts from a boyfriend even, like it can happen inside a committed relationship. How can we get rid of the idea that sex can never be transactional in this matter, that it can be owed, that women have a sexual debt to some men who've done them favors? monetary, practical, whatever, while this industry is around. I don't think we can, but we desperately must. It's the thinking underlying so much violence and abuse and harassment against all of us.
Yeah. So the law changed at some points. 2002, am I right? Can you kind of explain how Germany came to this particular arrangement?
Yeah, we have the people who believe prostitution is good. We also have many, many who believe it's maybe a mixed bag, but it's inevitable. So we might as well legislate around it and try to make it a little more tolerable. Can you imagine if we did that for domestic violence or child abuse? Make it a little more tolerable? Because, I mean, again, the health outcomes between domestic violence and prostitution are very similar.
Very connected to my mind.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, domestic violence can spiral into prostitution. How many husbands are pimping out their wives or boyfriends their girlfriends? It's one of the favorite tactics of traffickers. But anyway, Germany decided, out of a mix of saying it is good or neutral or inevitable, let's try and make it a little better for women. Because previously, like I said, there's always been a high tolerance towards the buyers and the brothel keepers. But it was still kind of in a legal gray area. So contracts set up inside the sex trade, both between the brothel owner and the woman and the buyer and the woman, were not legally binding. It was still considered, there's a legal term that's like against good morals. So very old, odd language. And that was struck down. The idea is now women can, like if a buyer doesn't pay them or the brothel owner doesn't hand over the earnings for the night, then she can sue. And that will improve her negotiating power. And also if women can pay into Social Security as prostitutes, then they'll have more safety, social safety this way. And if the social standing can improve and good things will happen. And there's been a lot of investigations into this. I mean, now we have over 20 years of evidence that none of this has actually worked out. What we've really done is empower and embolden the buyers and the brothel owners. It is so rare that a woman will actually take someone to court. Brothel owners are still extremely brazen. They take more than 50% of women's earnings. They're taking these exorbitant brothel room rents off of women. And they can now do that. They feel very legally secure by being designated employers, essentially, or, landlords to women, rather than shady, potentially criminal businessmen. Trafficking is harder to prosecute because we've narrowed the definition. Now, essentially, if you want to win against the trafficker in court, you have to prove that he severely restricted your freedom of movement or forced you to do specific sex acts on specific men. But traffickers don't usually need to do that. They just place you in a brothel and just go, well, just bring me this amount of money. So even a traffic victim might occasionally be able to turn a man down, and that can then be used as evidence to say, oh, but she had a little bit of wriggle room. This isn't trafficking. Because even the legal system and many of the lawyers and judges still think a woman is chained to a radiator. No, in Germany, a good place to traffic a woman to is a legal brothel. You present her as an independent sex worker, but she's actually trafficked. And it's not that hard to disguise trafficking this way. That happens all the time. We know because occasionally it gets busted, but it takes the police 6, 7, 8 years. And oftentimes that means many of the initial victims, they're gone. They're elsewhere. Some of them will be dead. And the buyers too. I mean, we've already talked about it is a problematic way of thinking to go, I've put down money on this person. Now they must do these sex acts with me and they must do them to my satisfaction. Now add to that the society has said, you are a client, you are a customer. If I hire somebody to fix my kitchen and they just go, I don't feel like this anymore, they leave it half finished. Obviously, I can get upset. I can put pressure on them to finish fixing my kitchen. But if in prostitution, you can do that to somebody who, in a sex act, like I thought as a society, we're trying to say, we have around Me Too, so many conversations around consent going, actually, you can always stop sex acts. If you're tired, if you're not feeling it, if you're whatever, for whatever reason, you're always allowed to interrupt. You're always allowed to say no. In prostitution, many of the buyers punish the women for it. They will shout at them. They will steal from them, rob them, assault them, sometimes kill them We've even had a case of a man successfully suing a woman because her ad said something like orgasm guarantee, and he didn't have one. So he dragged her to court, and the female judge asked her to pay him the money back.
Amazing.
So these, theoretically, the law says a woman can interrupt a sex act. In practice, if you are known, and the buyers, they have forums, they have websites where they give each other intelligence on where to find the compliant woman. If you are known as a difficult woman who says no, who puts firm boundaries, who is very limited in what she's willing to do, you're just going to get destroyed by bad reviews and the competition of the more desperate women who will have less boundaries.
But also, to my mind, this is why prostitution exists for men in the first place, is for them to have access to women who don't want them.
Exactly. Like that is the fundamental. So the average sex buyer, or prostitution buyer, I wouldn't say that he's a sadist per se, though it does veer into that direction very quickly. They just go, I don't feel like romancing someone today. I don't feel like seduction. I don't feel like foreplay. I don't feel like looking at her tastes, preferences, feelings. I don't feel like handling today that the woman at the bar, the club, the Tinder date says no. I don't want to hear no today. And at the brothel, I do have I'd say like 95% guarantee. I will find somebody who matches my preferences of what I find appealing, even somebody half my age, a third of my age, and she will do what I want, whatever that is. Like I mentioned at the beginning, whether it's very standard stuff, just oral, vaginal, or I want something more brutal, somebody will do it. And I don't owe anything to her except money. This is the lowest, fewest strings attached in the minds of men sex that they can have. And they don't tend to think beyond it. They don't tend to think, why is she there? How does she feel? Is she all right? No, she's a sex professional. She can take it. Those women, there's a lot of racialization. Those women from Eastern Europe or those women from Africa, basically women from anywhere, but often with like a racialized base, she's kind of wild and kinky or whatever, or she's more robust and strong and she can take it.
I think, again, like part of what they're paying for is a exit out of their own humanity. They don't have to think about the social, circumstances that brought her here. They don't have to think about her life in any capacity. They don't have to think about their own behavior towards her or their social responsibility towards her. They literally not just bypass consent, but bypass humanity altogether.
And I found, I've done a lot of reading what these men themselves say in their forums where they talk to each other. And I do realize that's not 100% representative sample. These are the high frequency buyers. They call themselves hobbyists. So buying access to women is a hobby to them. So those high frequency men who do make up a lot of the prostitution transactions, they make it a real system of finding the most compliant women, finding the women who will be most specific to their demands. And they have really gross language for women who don't comply. So one of the terms that the German men have coined is the rip-off cunt. That is a literal translation of the term they use. They feel very, very irked and wronged by somebody who doesn't come through. And yeah, the point is, I found these men, they have very few limits. It's really frightening how far they will go, including like continuing when a woman is in pain, or sometimes stealthing women, like she says, please use a condom. They don't do it. They are not scared of prosecution. Even though the law says you can't rape a woman overtly or strip off a condom, they do this. The few things that they're afraid of, one is being beaten up by a pimp. They are fully aware just how dangerous and violent the organized gangs who circle around all of this are. That puts the fear in them sometimes. And the other is a number of them are unwilling to pay to abuse a minor. So there is some limits. There are some things that they do worry about, including we're still working on even the compassion for the underage victims of exploitation, but there is a little bit of a cultural taboo. It's still frightening how many women enter the industry as minors and have plenty of men willing to pay to abuse, but the high frequency buyers, many of them do consider that a limit if she's under 18. And so when people say, like, it doesn't make any difference to forbid something, like, again, back to this inevitability comment, they go, well, you can't criminalize these men. They just will do it anyway. I can see that there is not enough, but there's some limit on their behavior. It's just the adults are really well and truly free game under this system. We now have itty bit of restrictions around the paid abuse of pregnant women and so-called gangbangs, but essentially they still do that in a slightly more limited capacity under code language. So it's still happening.
You do talk about the idea that women are in it voluntarily, essentially, because it's an acceptable way to make money. But the truth is, blatant and evident everywhere, that the demand for prostitution, for sexual slavery in this manner, cannot be met with just women entering on their own volition. We know this beyond a shadow of a doubt. So it necessitates coercion, this fact that you have to lure women in, you have to coerce women in, you have to prey on vulnerable women like immigrants without paper, et cetera, and of course, minors. So you have to have a criminal element in order to make this whole thing go around. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, we know that for sure. So a case study that I often point to is the Paradise brothel. This is an infamous mega brothel, but it went bust for systematic human trafficking. And part of the court proceedings, the mega pimp, who used to be on TV as a respected or semi-respected businessman, he said, we had trouble filling the rooms with women in year one of opening that brothel. And so where did we go? We went to the organized crime gangs because they can always supply us with fresh women. Yeah. That is not an isolated case. There have been trafficking rings busted in countless legal brothels and countless legal street prostitution areas, escort agencies. It is the same. But I do find it important to emphasize, just because a woman makes a choice to enter prostitution, let's say she's not trafficked, she's not poor, she's not without options, she's not traumatized, she doesn't have any kind of like dark history, that doesn't mean that she's going to be safe in prostitution or respected. She still meets, maybe not exactly, but an overlapping group of men. She can still get a sadistic buyer. She can still get a disrespectful one, a stalker. And I know women who say, I am a high-class escort and a sex worker, and they have pretty horrific stories about abuse and assault as well. Like I said, there's not a sector where things are so different. And I sometimes take issue with other feminists who go, those top 5% in the prostitution or the porn industry, they're letting down their sisters. And it's not about saying that a woman who has a very big public profile and promotes the industry has no responsibility as a role model to younger women and girls. I'm not saying never hold a woman responsible for spreading dangerous ideas, but most likely that woman has gone through things quite similar to the other women. If you listen to them a little bit longer, they don't have a magic protective shield around them where only the nice men, the young, attractive, nice men come and they're having fun and drinking Prosecco on satin sheets. And it is important that we don't focus our ire when we get angry and upset about the industry at those women. I think we should be focusing on the mega brothel owners, at the pornographers, at the big fat cats in the game, rather than those women, because many of them do at some point decide, oh, actually, I don't want to be known as a prostitute publicly. I want to pull back. I want to question what has been happening. Some of them do end up switching sides, and they leave the sex work camp. And if we have said, you are part of the problem, you're a handmaiden, you're a threat to young women, if we don't give them a chance to come to the feminist analysis and find the solidarity and get the services or whatever it is they need or they want to do, then they will be politically homeless. They have no one to turn to. So that's an important point for me. Yes, hold women accountable who harass others or who spread dangerous ideas, but always talk about the ideas. It's better not to go after the individual or publicly psychoanalyze anybody, and give women the space to change their minds and focus on those with real structural power. And it's very rarely those women. Some of them turn to brothel owners and pimps, but it's still a small number compared to all the men who are invisible and hiding behind these women. And the thing is, when you have these high-class escorts or poor performers, you don't know what their life was like. Many people make this assumption. I've recently seen it directed at this one porn performer who went viral for doing a gangbang with 100 men.
So
you might have
sad.
heard of her. And people have gone, wow, she's middle class. She must have made a free choice. How do you know? You don't know what her childhood was like. You don't know what her youth was like. She's very young. She grew up in the COVID years. She was on social media as a teen. At the start of the conversation, like I was talking about how much violence there was for me growing up in the supposedly safe middle class. Bad things never happened in middle class homes, blah, blah, blah. You don't know what happened to her. You don't know her story. The public made a ton of assumptions that she must be autonomous. There must be nothing going on. When she's there publicly saying, sex is what I'm good for. There are many ways that women can arrive at this. And yes, it's often familial violence, but it can also be our culture. I think we're at a stage where, and this has been described by Gail Dines in her work around porn as well, where the pornographers say the women come to the set porn ready. Okay, maybe you weren't abused, but we live in a society where our average exposure to porn as children is now at the age of like 9 or 10. A 9 or 10-year-old seeing hardcore porn, that can be a traumatic event. That can shape your view of your body, male-female relationships, sexuality. It can destroy it or severely harm it for a very long time. And for those girls then to grow up and think, yeah, I mean, brutal sex, that's normal, might as well get paid. I'm saying even if she hasn't been through the incest boot camp, she's been through the cultural boot camp. And that can lead to some very dark places. And we need to have compassion for all victims of the industry, for all people caught up, and not put them into groups like compassion for her because she has a very dark story and she's proven it to us. And I don't know her story, so she must be a patriarchal collaborator. I'm really, really against this narrative that I sometimes see from my own side.
I agree with that. I feel like in my lifetime, I've seen a sort of hardening and brutalization of sexual relations between men and women. And if all you are taught is that sex is an act of degradation of the woman, where's your sexuality going to be if that is what shapes you? I wanted to jump to something else you said earlier, which is that older men who go to the brothels or escorts, they invariably go to younger women. Youth is the one huge common denominator where men go for as young as they possibly can, and where men fuck women that are the age of their grandchildren or children.
Yes. And depressingly, when it comes to age of consent in prostitution, that we've raised that to 18. But actually, in many countries, the minimum age for prostitution used to be 16. And it's quite recent that we've raised it to 18 or above. So in Germany, we raised it to 18 in 2008. In Switzerland, we raised it to 18 in 2013. That's still very recent. That means there are survivors of legalized, state-sanctioned child trafficking or teen trafficking. I still think trafficking a 16 or 17-year-old is a horrific crime. Patriarchy loves to do this. Oh, the girl, there's signs of puberty. She's basically a woman. I mean, age of consent laws in Germany are kind of crazy anyway, because it's 14.
Same in Sweden.
If we made it legal again for men to buy 16-year-olds, many of them would rush to it. They would be there like this. And so, yes, there is an obsession with youth. Most people, if you ask them, are you against pedophilia? They say yes. But then you give them these case studies and they go, well, those are kind of like fallen girls, difficult girls, precocious girls, like we see with the victims of now the grooming gang scandal in the UK. I can't speak to all of it, but just to say men in organized groups getting together to do male bonding through systematic rape and trafficking of girls is a vastly underestimated issue. And our culture often still blames the girls. Even the social workers who work with them day to day go, well, these girls, they're difficult runaways. There's a group of girls that society really loves blaming and giving up on. And just wondering, why is she so difficult? Well, because since she's been 11 or 12, she's been treated like an object and she's been sexually tortured again and again. So of course she has no self-worth. Of course she has a hard time figuring out who's safe to be with. To her, abuse feels normal, like coming home. It's a bad home, but it is home. And then these girls, they grow up and they're 18. Are they now sex workers? Because they've turned 18? Like, can you go from child trafficking victim to sex worker overnight? In the minds of many people, yes. And worse yet, the pro-prostitution lobby, who is spreading this term sex worker so successfully, all the media uses it, all the journalists, most of the left-wing people, and it's now trickling down and children are being called sex workers. And I've written about this on my blog. There isn't just a few strange lefty Twitter accounts speaking of child sex workers, underage sex workers, minors in sex work. The New Zealand government has used that in their official evaluations of their prostitution law. It's been used by subgroups of UNICEF. It's been used by researchers on the issue. So we're on a very dangerous place culturally, because if we say the 18-year-old, she's doing fine, is it so bad for the 17-year-old, the 16-year-old? Is it that bad? Isn't she just starting work a little early? That slippery slope is very much there. And again, we're just psychoanalyzing the girls. We're not asking, why do so many men have such a hunger for such vulnerability?
Yeah.
Why are they not disgusted with themselves?
Yeah. Why?
But any sensible adult sees a minor, they're like sexually invisible to them. It doesn't cross their mind. Why are there so many men who go, that's exactly what I want? The most vulnerable.
Yeah, and it needs to be looked into, just as you mentioned before, the sort of coalitional nature of men working together to predate. I think it's a very, very, very old practice that we're just not talking enough about at all. Was the Nordic model or the equality model ever on the table in Germany?
It is now. We're going to have elections again because our government went bust. We currently have a coalition of Labour, Greens, and neoliberals. And they're most likely going to get crushed in the next election. It's going to be the Conservatives again. After giving so much depressing information, the good news is that Germany has looked at the evidence and we have a raging public debate about this issue.
That's good.
And the last 10 years, people have increasingly gotten to know what the Nordic model is, what it might be able to do in Germany if properly written and enforced. There are big supporters. There are some very vocal voices in most bigger parties, and now the Conservatives have it as part of their official program. The only issue is that it is always easy to demand things when you're the opposition, because now while they're the opposition, they can go, oh, you're failing women and girls, and if we get in power, we'll do it so much better. Will they? They have been neglecting women's shelters for decades while they were in power under Merkel. They have neglected rape crisis centers. They have neglected exit from prostitution services. They don't particularly show a lot of care towards the specific issues of female migrants, but now they want to paint themselves as our liberators. We'll wait and see.
Yeah.
We will take them as allies, but cautiously. Yeah. At the end of the day, we have had countries like Canada, for instance, where the Conservatives brought in the Nordic model, and then the Liberals came back to power. The Liberals went, we don't want this. And they've barely been enforcing it. So you can have a Nordic model on the books, but it's not being put into action. And you can even have a government and city governments, municipal governments, just defying the law. Because what we really need, we're working on it. It's a long, probably intergenerational battle. You have to be galvanized locally to say, I want my town to have exit services. I want my town to have safe houses. I want my town or my municipality to have a trafficking-focused police force, specially trained. And we have to say it is so important to us, we will make room for it in our municipal budget. People go, oh, that sounds expensive. I don't know if we can help women. Can we afford that? Every municipality has to fight the battle. Yes, the national conversation matters, but so does the local one. And when people throw up their hands and say, oh, we can't really resource exit services for women in prostitution, that to me feels hypocritical, because they would never say that about other types of crimes.
But I also think that whether it's local or federal politics, they are very much in bed with the prostitution business. One,
Yes.
It's a huge business, a huge moneymaker for the country. Germany's called Europe's brothel, not for no reason, I'm assuming. But also, aren't they customers? Aren't they Johns?
Yeah, policemen, judges, politicians, most of them not openly. Interesting enough, there is a cultural tolerance, but most of them are married. So the wife at home is the reason they're not out and proud, one of the reasons. It is an uphill battle. because we spent the last 20 years letting brothel owners like run amok all over the place culturally, they're on all the talk shows. They have lobby groups, legal lobby groups, who are knee deep involved in parliament. Every time there's any inkling that anything slightly abolitionist or prostitution critical is happening, they're right there, emailing, contacting, knocking on the doors of all the politicians. Some of them have really good connections to specific politicians from across the political spectrum. When they passed the law in 2002, there are photos of our justice minister drinking champagne with a brothel owner. And again, this is not new. This has been around for a long time. I mean, brothels have been the site of much politicking, male-only, male-dominated politicking. Brothel owners historically have held some sway. I mean, if brothel owners and women in prostitution could speak openly about who shows up at their door, all the divorces that would happen, like all the outcry, all the heartbreak of the cheated on women and mothers of men's children, like the estimate is that roughly a quarter of German men pay for prostitution. Not all of them high frequency, but who have done it at least once and could be prone to sympathy to other men because they've been there. Male solidarity. There are a lot of men who've never done this, but they kind of like to keep the option. If they're ever lonely or don't feel like, again, romancing someone tonight, even though it hasn't happened to them, they go and band together. And so that's definitely happening around this issue as well. I don't accuse every man who speaks publicly in favor of prostitution of being a buyer, even though some of them definitely are. Just, it's amazing how much male solidarity there is around the worst crimes that men commit, frankly. And that's why I'm trying to really emphasize that we as women shouldn't do this. They would love it if all the feminists do is attack the women who say, I'm a happy sex worker, and we just fight it out. Rather than us feminists going, the woman who says she's happy in prostitution, she's not my enemy. She's still my sister. We might disagree. We might fight politically, but we're not buying the men's narrative that we should be embattled and forgetting about all that they're doing.
No, and of course, it's very effective sort of political strategy to separate women, fragment us all into different camps that are fighting each other while they bond over our oppression, not to be too like on the nose.
Exactly.
But I wanted to talk about what you just mentioned, that what it sounds like and the picture you paint is that of, you know, once you accepted prostitution into your society, you really, it's been market expansion from there.
Yes.
And so a lot of people naively think that if you allow for prostitution, you have this, like you said, kind of escape valve, and it's just going to be contained in the small part of the culture. But that is not at all what's happening. Once you give it power, it takes root and expands all over the place.
There's many aspects to it. One is the drop in prices. So we have seen a market drop in the average price. So prostitution in Germany is especially cheap. It's much more expensive in Sweden. That's not to say Sweden is doing a perfect job, far from it, but at least the prices are higher on average. But prices can fluctuate, which is exactly why it's so dangerous to make sexual boundaries of women the subject of market forces. You have a pandemic, prices drop. You have flooding, prices drop, like natural disasters. You have an economic crash, prices drop. And suddenly women in the street, it went down to being prices that you could pay in coins. That's how low it can go. Prices in brothels you can get full access to a woman's most intimate parts, so I'm speaking vaginal sex, vaginal penetration, for something like $50-$60 in a flat rate brothel, or in a, what are they called, Laufhaus. There are these brothels where women just rent the rooms, and the women, they have to see somewhere between 2 or 3 men before they even start making even for the day, because that's how high the room rent is. And when prices drop, that means maybe so far she said, I will not do anal, or I will not let them film me. And now she's like, if I want to make the same money I did 2 years ago, I have to do this now. So that destroys autonomy. What else happens? People always go, and it's legal. You can do oversight. You can go to the brothels and have a chat with the women and see how they're doing. And that way you can identify cases of abuse. Forget it. The market is so huge. there are the mega brothels. Sure, there's the street area. These are the most visible kinds. But actually, the biggest chunk of the market are relatively anonymous. You can find them online, but they're not, they don't have red windows. Apartment brothels. So reality is, it could be that the flat next door to mine is a brothel. And maybe it's a pop-up brothel. So it's only there for a month or two, and then it's gone. This is like how fast everything is and how expansive that if I was the mayor and I said I want oversight of the red light industry, it changes so quick, I can't get a hold of it. It escapes my grasp constantly. Again, so much of it is in these apartments, and they're all over the place. They do tend to be in the poorer parts of town where the landlords are not as involved. But yeah, an exploded market means you can have these brothels directly in your neighborhood, and they look very anonymous. And the only way you would notice is if occasionally you might see, well, mostly the buyers rocking up. Some of them are drunk or high, and then they ring your doorbell. And I know this for a fact because I talked to a woman who lived in a building where this was happening. The buyers kept ringing her doorbell because they couldn't find the right entry to the brothel. So an exploded market has an impact on the surrounding community. And it is just too much for authorities to keep up with and keep shutting these places down. It's so hard to rein in.
Yeah, I also think it creates a certain mentality in men. We're all for sale.
Potentially. I mentioned it, right, in job search, apartment search, and dating, that exact mentality. Maybe I could buy her. That's why it affects all of us. The world is my brothel mentality. I don't know if those men are conscious that they act this way. And like I said, many of them, this overlaps with the pickup artists. They approach woman after woman, until someone says yes. And if you just do it often enough, then as a strategy for your own personal sexual satisfaction, yeah, that can work out. It's terrible, and I think it should be criminalized, but it is a strategy. There's always someone desperate enough or shocked enough or pushed into the corner enough that they might say yes. And that's how some women end up in prostitution. If you ask women how they got in, many of them, it wasn't a conscious choice. Like, I'll start today at the brothel, I'll start today at the escort agency. Many of them had situations that only in retrospect could they say, oh, that actually was my first dipping my toes in. It was like friend of a friend. And then he gave me money after, and I went, oh, I glad for the money. And only later do you go, oh, he thought this was this is what happened here.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about the mega brothels because it's such a German phenomenon. I know they have them in other countries as well, but you did this fantastic YouTube series, essentially a commentary video series on documentary television series about the building and opening of Paradise that you mentioned earlier, this mega brothel. Can you tell me a little bit about its story? And I know it's a lot because it goes into the Johns, it goes into the girls that work there, it goes into the staff that runs it and everything else.
The Paradise, it is a brothel chain. So actually, what people have to understand, it's not one brothel, one owner. And there's also the Pasha chain, the Arrow Center chain, and the Paradise. Like I mentioned, they were later sentenced for systematic human trafficking that had been going on basically the entire time it was run. But at the start, they were very smart about their marketing. The owners of this, so that was when the now convicted human trafficker's name was Jürgen Rudloff, and he had a PR manager whose name escapes me right now, but they came up with this idea, brothel sounds bad, let's call ourselves sauna clubs. That sounds so much nicer. Men come for sauna, they come for a bath. It's easier to the public to sell the sauna club rather than the brothel, just like sex work is easier to sell than prostitution. You can sell it as, okay, you and your group of mates, there's food here, there's sauna, there's swimming, there's relaxation. You can just come and chat with your mates and have beers. And yeah, there's half-naked women because nudity is mandatory in a sauna club. A lot of these women wear maybe a string tanga and high heels, nothing else. You can just sit there in the atmosphere and enjoy it and feel like a king. You don't even have to buy access to the women. Just come to chill. It's also a way to ease the male customers in because they can go. Many men have said this, like, oh, I don't even go to the brothel just for the women. I just like to chat to my mates and I just like the atmosphere. To me, as a woman with self-respect, the brothel is a nightmare. But to some men, in a nice, relaxing atmosphere. You're also training the men into it, not just the women, into accepting it, normalizing it. Many men go out of curiosity. And it's different. If there's a lineup of women, you have to go and pick one. That can be overwhelming even to the male customer. He might feel uneasy about it. But this sauna club atmosphere really helps in that aspect as well. And they throw theme parties. Some of these brothels have concerts in them. And like I said, they were working very quickly with organized crime to supply women to the rooms. Meanwhile, going on television saying, we are the most ethical brothel out there. We are the standard. They talked about how they cooperate with the officials, and they have this binder with all the women's names and their IDs, and the police knows the women who are here, and still trafficking happened. Just when people say, I want oversight, I go, look at the Paradise as a case study. All this oversight, brutal trafficking still happened. Whenever the women needed to be disciplined, so-called, they would put them in their big cars and drive somewhere and physically beat them. Women having, many traffickers, they tattoo their victims. And I believe you have that in the Paradise case as well, where it can say something like property of such and such, or it is the gang insignia on the woman's body, that sort of thing. Yeah, what came of it? It was on the police radar. They raided it several times. And now a raid is its own thing. If fully armed police officers storm your building, many of the women who often come from countries where the police they're not perfect in Germany, but it is worse in Eastern Europe, where the police is often very corrupt, very brutal, might be working with the gangs. If these heavily armed police officers storm your building, that is often a frightening experience to those women. But it used to be that was basically most of what the police could do to surprise the traffickers, because you have to come on a random day and you have to really rush in so that they're not prepared to hide any evidence. It took them, I believe, 3 raids in total until they had gathered enough evidence to sentence not just the outside pimps who were bringing the women in and beating them up and tattooing them, but also the brothel owners, and showing they knew about this, they encouraged it. And that was a landmark judicial decision to decide, if you run a brothel and you enable this, you are liable. Because it used to be that the brothel owners got away with it. They just say, I don't know these gentlemen. I've never seen them before. Oh, this is so sad. Women were trafficked. This is terrible. This will never happen again. This is what they used to do. And it's become a little bit harder for them. But there haven't been many such convictions since, even though there should be. Because we know this is not a sad, terrible, isolated case. This is very standard. And if a brothel of that size, that renown, that cultural presence can be this horrific once investigated, we have to question all the other ones.
Yeah, and also I think that the sort of making it look like a legitimate business with the binders full of the women's names and the kitchen and the buffet for the workers, etc., it mimics, in a sense, like a corporate office. And so I think it's a tremendous hat trick of give it the surface sheen of a legitimate run business with the bureaucracy and the administration and the front people and the front desk, etc., to cover up and disguise very cleverly the human rights crimes that they're in the business of perpetrating. To me, the sense I got from watching it was I felt like it's a farm or farm animals or captive animals. It was so obvious slavery to me.
I find it important to make the point, yes, there was really bad violent trafficking, but even if there hadn't been, look at what the brothel, what it makes the women do legally. Having to wear nearly nothing. Do you think the men don't comment, don't verbally harass, don't physically feel up these women? Do you think when the man is sitting there in his bathrobe, because the men get to wear bathrobes, and the woman is sitting there fully nude, that he sees her as a full human being? When he goes, I want the Latina, I want the Black woman, I want the Romanian, I want the Asian one, who all have fake names and sometimes overtly degrading names, that is an equal business interaction. Let's say there were no pimps and no trafficking. Those women are just poor. This is inhumane. Like you said, this reeks of slavery. It is that, at least as a fantasy. And is a man who has a sexual slavery fantasy, is he a safe person? Do we want him to take up space in our society and be an influential businessman or whatever? Again, many of these men are fathers and husbands as well. Can we coexist in a society where a lot of men don't just fantasize about it, they play it out? Even without the trafficking, just they do it back on the poverty or the childhood trauma or the cultural grooming of those women. Even if the pimps weren't there, I could not accept this. I don't consent to living in a culture that does this and that has tried again and again to groom friends of mine and to a lesser extent myself. I just got lucky that I had women around me to warn me at the right time. If I had been in different circles at uni and been all up in the sex work ideas and ignored the sex trafficking news because that has nothing to do with me, and the assault and the femicide and the industry news, that has nothing to do with me, it could be me at the brothel. It could be any of us. It is more likely to happen to vulnerable women, but really it could be any of us because all you need to be is female and preferably under 50. That's how it works and why we need to stop it. The sex trafficking is the worst form, but even prostitution without sex trafficking is dehumanizing, dangerous, boundary violating, potentially femicidal. Like I said, I've studied the homicide of the women. Many of those women were not trafficked.
Let's talk about that, and not to end on the darkest note possible, but but I do want to talk. You wrote a great article about murder and violence and prostitution, and I think the statistics speak for themselves. Death rate in prostitution 10 times higher than any other field, including combat soldiers, liquor store clerks, taxi drivers, all notoriously dangerous professions. And in your German statistics, you say that the killers of prostitutes were 100% men, ages ranging from 15 to 61. The median age of a murder of prostitute was 33. The majority of them had no drugs or alcohol in their system, and the majority were German-born, not immigrants. So if you can talk a little bit about the article and the very real phenomena of homicide and prostitution.
If people have doubt, if they feel like I'm exaggerating that homicide or femicide, because it is misogyny that drives these crimes at its core, I would definitely class these as femicides. If they feel like that's exaggerated, is that really a daily concern for women? I always recommend go and look at the safety advice, not produced by people like me, but people who speak of sex work and say this is a job like any other. Their safety advice to women is keep the door unlocked so you can run. Check under the bed or under the car seat if he has weapons or ropes. This is where you need to knee him in the crotch to run. Don't wear long hair or jewelry that he could pull so that he could yank your head back or strangle you. There's been brothel owners who've talked about you can't have pillows in the rooms because they can be used to smother a woman to death. Why are there alarm buttons in the rooms? If femicide is not a thing that women, yes, of course, it only happens to a small group of women, but every woman lives in fear that it could be her. Every woman, actually, especially the escorts, because women in escorting, they go to unknown places with often unknown people. Could be a group of men waiting for them. Maybe they can find of one guy, but not 3, 4, 5. So femicide is a daily concern throughout the industry. It is worst in the streets because you get into a stranger's car, he can drive you wherever he wants to. That's why that's the most dangerous. But even escorting, like I just said, is very dangerous. And the type of men you're meeting, again, with the entitlement, that is dangerous. His ego is bruised. Like, men have murdered women, like I said, over small sums of money. They laughed at his erectile dysfunction. Right? She can't even laugh.
That's a big one. When I read that, I was like, of course. They pay to remove the possibility of rejection, and then they can't get it up, and then the woman laughs. The rage goes from 0 to 100, I'm sure. How does Germany, what does the culture think about the obvious phenomena of femicide in prostitution?
They're barely aware of it still.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even have official statistics. I mentioned this in my article. The German Public Bureau of Statistics says it is stigmatizing to class a murder victim as a prostitute, so therefore we won't do it, and so we don't have any data. Though that's common, across, we don't have good data on most crimes against women, but this is an especially upsetting, elaborate excuse. The femicide aspect, I don't actually often mention the femicide because it still shocks people too much. When you convince people of the abolitionist position, I tend to do it over time, slowly, incrementally, and we get to the murders very late. Because when you accept that right now there's millions of women globally, hundreds of thousands in a country like Germany, being assaulted for money, raped for money, traumatized for money, that is very heavy. And many people still want to block it out. So then to have to also think they're also all in danger of femicide, very, very often, that overwhelms people. And as a culture, we're not ready yet to go all the way to the femicide part. There is more and more discussion of it. There's what makes a big difference. I always emphasize this, and it remains true. Now, women who have survived this industry are speaking out. That, we live in this culture where we want to hear from people who lived it, which is important, but it takes such a toll on these women. This is a conversation we had over on Red Light Expose. I should emphasize that more. I'm part of a podcast project called Red Light Expose. Most of the women on the show have experienced porn and prostitution. They've survived it. And survivor is the right term, because I said near-death experiences are so common. Many of them know women who are no longer alive, directly or with the long-term, the slow death from trauma, suicide, illnesses. We have an episode which I would recommend where myself and Andrea's a woman exited from Canadian prostitution. She wasn't trafficked, but it was still a very traumatizing experience that she deals with today and that she feels compelled to speak about to this day. And we discuss how somehow, despite all Me Too and everything, when it comes to prostitution, we forget how vulnerable sex is. And it is seen as moralizing and pearl clutching to say, when a man and a woman are alone in a room, especially when they're strangers, most men are physically stronger than women. Sex is vulnerable. Somebody being inside your body is inherently vulnerable. It's wonderful, and it can be great fun and ecstasy when it's with the right person, a safe person, a respectful person, with mutual enthusiasm. This is not about hating sex. It's that we even have to say that is ridiculous, I know. But it is when it is unsafe, exceptionally dangerous. A lot of these men are attacking the women during the acts. It is not anti-sex or anti-woman to say that sex is vulnerable and that we live in a society with a lot of misogyny, especially against women in the industry, especially by their so-called customer. That is very dangerous, and it cannot be reformed to be another way, because if he sees her as a full human being, he sees she's potentially half his age, potentially barely speaks his language, she's going through things, she might be struggling with addiction, poverty, like whatever it is. If he sees her as a person, three-dimensional human being, he will go, I'm not doing this. I will not proceed. That's the kind of society we would want to get to, where men say, I don't want any part of this. I want to keep my own humanity by not taking away hers. I will not participate, and I will tell my mates not to do this. We need men to start telling off other men. And there is a small but growing movement of men doing this. Most of them, I have to say, they have feminist sisters, mothers, wives, girlfriends. But
the idea that men have been able to distance themselves from women to the degree that they objectify women and see them as such other, like you would a dog or a steak or a glass of wine. They're just a consumable thing. The damage to the man is considerable, but also the damage that he then can do is frightening.
That's essentially the question to men. Do you want to live in a society where you have more resources, more power, but you're disconnected from yourself? You will never have deep, true human connection, even to other men, because it's all about connecting over putting others down, and certainly never to women. Would you rather have that or share fairly and live equally on eye level? And sadly, many men are still choosing the former, or now pretending that you can be equal. You just call her a sex worker and then it is equal. That's what the lefty men do. They find ways of justifying, continuing these practices by reframing them. But like I said, there's some men who do want the latter, and we need them to be louder and more organized. It's because it shouldn't just be women dragging the culture back from this hell pit.
But I also think there is some truth, a huge truth to, if you have a society in which women thrive, you have a thriving society. You have a society in which women are oppressed and exploited and brutalized. No one thrives in that society. No one.
How can children thrive? I mean, again, I shouldn't have to, the value of women should be enough. I shouldn't have to pivot to the children, but the children of women born through prostitution. Some women have given birth in German brothels. It is also a child rights crisis in many ways, in so many ways. But people are waking up slowly. Not fast enough, but things are moving in the right direction right now in Germany at this point in time. And we just have to keep going despite this like David Goliath situation, astronomical proportions.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your work for one. And also, I do think the one thing that's going to break the spell, so to speak, are actually people talking about what it actually is, rather than this fantasy notion of free market fantasy, that it's going to take that in order for this awakening to take place and for society to correct itself.
Totally. I don't think everyone has to join a lobbying group. It's cliche, but you can start at your dinner table. If you have the emotional bandwidth, and I understand if people can't go deep into this all the time. I take long breaks and then just do something in my free time that's totally unrelated to this, because you can't be stewing in it all the time. But to the extent that you have capacity, once you have gathered information, to go and have these conversations with friends and family, it does make a difference. One, you will feel less crazy because you will find someone who agrees with you. Maybe they've been having these thoughts. So many women out there, when they hear the sex work line, and even some men, they go, I don't really buy this, but all my friends agree. I guess it must be true. I guess this is the liberal lefty line now. I must sign my name to this. And then to have someone say, actually, if you don't like porn, what it says about men and women, you don't like what brothels say about men and women, yeah, me too, and all these other people too, then you're not crazy, you're not alone, and that can be the start of something, personally, group-wise, and culture-wide.
Well said. I so appreciate just the conversation that's putting this issue in front of people and giving people some place to go and find the opposing narrative and exposing of the industry as such. So I really appreciate your frankness, your clarity, and your willingness to stick with this and keep talking about it.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And thank you to everyone who listened all the way to the end despite the heaviness.
Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love to know your thoughts on these conversations, so please drop a note on the website or find us on social media. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Subject to Power on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, Elle. Audio engineering is done by Jason Sheasley at Abridged Audio, cover art by B. Johnson, and music by Beware of Darkness.